Margaret Harrison had been in pain for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to live without it. Every morning when she woke up in the guest suite of her son's mansion, the pain greeted her like an old, unwelcome friend. Sharp stabbing sensations in her joints. A constant burning in her muscles. Headaches that made her eyes water. At 72 years old, Margaret had accepted that pain was simply part of aging. That's what the doctors told her. Arthritis, they said. Fibromyalgia. Normal degeneration. They prescribed pills that made her drowsy but did nothing for the pain. They suggested physical therapy that she was too exhausted to attend. They told her to rest, to take it easy, to accept her limitations. So she did. She spent her days in the guest suite, mostly in bed or sitting by the window, watching the world go by without her. She'd once been vibrant, active, the kind of woman who volunteered at 3 different charities and took dance classes twice a week. Now, she could barely walk from her bedroom to the bathroom without feeling like her body was tearing itself apart. Her son, David Harrison, had insisted she move in with him and his wife 2 years ago, after she'd fallen in her own home and spent 12 hours on the floor before a neighbor found her. David meant well. He'd set her up in the nicest guest suite, hired help to cook and clean for her, made sure she had everything she needed. Everything except what she really wanted. Her independence, her dignity, her life back. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And please, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. David Harrison was the founder and CEO of Harrison Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity company worth over $2 billion. At 45, he'd achieved the kind of success most people only dreamed about. Multiple homes, private jets, influence in tech and political circles. He'd built his empire from nothing, working 18-hour days for 20 years, driven by a fierce determination to give his family the security he'd never had growing up. His mother had raised him alone after his father died when David was 8. They'd been poor, struggling, often unsure where the next meal would come from. Margaret had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, sacrificing everything so David could go to college. Every success David achieved, he achieved for her. To prove her sacrifices hadn't been in vain. To give her the comfortable life she deserved. When Margaret's health started declining 3 years ago, David had been traveling for business and hadn't noticed at first. By the time he realized how bad things had gotten, his mother had already withdrawn from most of her activities, isolated herself, and seemed to have given up on life. Moving her into his home had seemed like the perfect solution. She'd be safe, cared for, never alone. But David was rarely there. His work demanded constant attention. Board meetings, investor calls, expansion into international markets. He traveled 3 weeks out of every month. When he was home, he was usually in his office on conference calls. He told himself that providing for his mother was the same as being there for her. He was wrong. David's wife, Vanessa, had seemed supportive of Margaret moving in, at least at first. Vanessa was 38, beautiful in a sharp, calculated way. She'd been David's executive assistant before becoming his wife 5 years ago, shortly after his first wife died of cancer. She knew how to manage his schedule, anticipate his needs, and present herself as the perfect corporate spouse. Margaret had never quite warmed to Vanessa. There was something about the younger woman that made Margaret uncomfortable. The way Vanessa's smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she was charming in public but cold in private. The way she seemed to view everything, including people, as assets to be managed or obstacles to be removed. But Margaret kept her concerns to herself. David loved Vanessa. He seemed happy, or at least content. And Margaret didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law who caused problems. So when Vanessa suggested that Margaret stay in the guest suite rather than move around the house freely, Margaret agreed. "You need your rest," Vanessa had said sweetly. "And with David traveling so much, I don't want you to feel like you need to entertain me or keep me company. You should focus on your health." It seemed reasonable, thoughtful even. Margaret hadn't realized it was isolation. The guest suite was in a separate wing of the massive house, down a long hallway from the main living areas. It was beautiful, certainly. Expensive furniture, a king-sized bed, a private bathroom, even a small sitting area. But it was far from everything. far from the kitchen, the living room, the places where life happened. Far from anyone who might notice what was happening to her. At first, the arrangement seemed fine. Staff brought Margaret her meals 3 times a day. A nurse came once a week to check her vitals and refill her medications. Vanessa would visit occasionally, usually when David was home, asking how Margaret was feeling, if she needed anything. Margaret appreciated not being a burden. She spent her days reading, watching television, looking out the window at the garden she could no longer walk through. She told herself this was enough. But as months passed, things started changing in small ways that Margaret couldn't quite define. Her meals, while still delivered regularly, became simpler. Less variety. Often the same bland foods day after day. When she mentioned craving her favorite dish, chicken piccata, nothing changed. She still got the same rotation of plain chicken, steamed vegetables, and rice. The staff who'd initially been friendly became distant. They'd drop off meals and leave quickly, barely making eye contact. When Margaret tried to strike up conversations, they'd make excuses about being busy. The weekly nurse visits became bi-weekly, then monthly. Vanessa explained that the nurse said Margaret was stable and didn't need such frequent monitoring. Margaret's pain medications ran out, and when she asked for refills, there were delays. Days would pass before someone brought her pills. During those gaps, her pain would intensify to unbearable levels. She'd lie in bed crying, unable to move, wondering why it took so long to refill a simple prescription. When she finally got the medication, it didn't seem to work as well as it used to. The worst part was the isolation. Days would go by where the only human contact Margaret had was someone silently delivering a meal tray. No conversation. No companionship. Just the 4 walls of her beautiful prison. She tried to leave the suite, to walk to the main house, but the pain made it difficult. Her joints would scream with every step. By the time she'd make it halfway down the long hallway, she'd be exhausted and have to turn back. A few times she'd manage to reach the living area, only to find it empty. The house was enormous, and she never knew where anyone was. She tried calling for help on her cell phone, but the service in her wing was terrible. Calls would drop constantly. She mentioned this to Vanessa once. "Oh, that's strange," Vanessa had said with concern that seemed genuine. "I'll have someone look into it." No one ever did. Margaret began to feel like a ghost in her son's house. Present but invisible. Alive but forgotten. She told herself she was being overly sensitive, that everyone was busy, that she should be grateful for the roof over her head. But deep down, she felt abandoned. David called her once a week, usually on Sunday evenings. The conversations were brief. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "I'm okay, sweetheart. A little pain, but that's normal." "Are they taking good care of you?" "Yes, of course." "Good. I'll be home in 2 weeks. We'll have dinner together." They rarely did. Something always came up. An emergency meeting. A last-minute trip. David's promises were sincere but empty. Margaret didn't blame him. She knew he was working hard. She knew he had important responsibilities. She just wished she could tell him how lonely she was. How much pain she was in. How invisible she felt. But she didn't want to worry him. Didn't want to be a burden. So she smiled during their brief video calls and said she was fine. One afternoon, about 18 months after moving into the mansion, Margaret woke from a nap feeling worse than usual. The pain was excruciating, radiating through her entire body. She tried to get up to use the bathroom and collapsed. She lay on the floor, unable to move, tears streaming down her face. She called out for help, but her voice was weak. The suite was so far from everything. No one could hear her. She managed to drag herself to her phone, but when she tried to call for help, she had no signal. She lay there for hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, before finally managing to crawl back to bed. When the dinner tray was delivered that evening, the staff member simply left it by the door and walked away, never noticing Margaret's distress. Margaret realized then that she could die in this room and no one would know for hours. Maybe days. That's when the fear really set in. Something was very wrong. This wasn't just age or illness. This was something else. But what? And more importantly, why? Margaret started paying closer attention to everything. Her meals. Her medications. the patterns of when people came and went. She noticed that her pain seemed worse after taking her medications, not better. That her food, while bland, sometimes had a strange bitter aftertaste. That the staff avoided looking at her, as if they knew something she didn't. She tried to bring up her concerns to the visiting nurse, but the nurse dismissed them. "You're experiencing normal progression of your conditions, Mrs. Harrison. It's common for elderly patients to feel increased discomfort." The nurse's tone was professional but cold. When Margaret asked about seeing her regular doctor, the nurse said that wasn't necessary. Everything was being monitored appropriately. Margaret felt trapped. She had no way to reach out for help. No way to tell anyone what was happening. Her son was unreachable, consumed by work. The staff was distant and dismissive. And Vanessa, the only other person in the house most of the time, visited less and less. When Vanessa did visit, usually right before David was due home, she'd bring fresh flowers for Margaret's room and ask cheerfully how she was feeling. Margaret tried once to express her concerns. "I feel like I'm getting worse, not better. And the medication doesn't seem to help." Vanessa's face had shown perfect concern. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry you're struggling. I'll talk to your doctors about adjusting your treatment. You just focus on resting." Nothing changed. In fact, things got worse. Margaret's lucid moments became fewer. She'd have periods where she couldn't think clearly, where everything was foggy and confused. She'd lose track of time. Hours, sometimes entire days, would disappear. During her clearer moments, Margaret tried to piece together what was happening. She started hiding her pills instead of taking them, slipping them under her mattress. Within a few days of not taking the medication, her mind cleared significantly. The fog lifted. She could think more clearly than she had in months. That's when she knew. She was being drugged. But by whom? And what? The realization was terrifying. She was trapped in a mansion with people who were deliberately harming her. Her own family's home had become a prison, and she had no way out. Margaret knew she needed to tell David, but how? He was always traveling, always busy. And would he even believe her? Would he think his elderly mother was just confused, paranoid? Margaret needed proof. She started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The times meals arrived. What she ate. How she felt afterward. The medications she was given. The interactions with staff. She hid the journal under her mattress with the pills. She also started documenting things with her phone when she could get it to work. Photos of her pills. Voice memos describing what was happening. Anything that might help her prove what was being done to her. But Margaret was running out of time. Without taking the medications, she was more alert, but the actual pain of her arthritis and other conditions was much worse. She could barely move without crying out. She was torn between mental clarity and physical agony. And she was terrified that whoever was doing this to her would realize she'd stopped taking the pills. She needed help. She needed her son. She needed someone, anyone, to see what was happening in this beautiful house in this expensive room where she was slowly being destroyed. One night, unable to sleep due to pain, Margaret managed to send David a text message. "Please come home. I need to talk to you. It's important." 3 days later, David replied, "Sorry, Mom, stuck in Singapore. Everything okay? Staff says you're doing fine." Margaret stared at the message, tears streaming down her face. The staff was lying. And David believed them over her. She tried to call him, but as always, she had no signal in her room. She tried to walk to another part of the house where her phone might work, but the pain was too intense. She collapsed in the hallway, unable to go further. A staff member found her and helped her back to her room, but reported to Vanessa, not David. Vanessa visited that evening, her face a mask of concern. "Margaret, you need to stay in your room. You're too weak to be walking around. You could really hurt yourself." "I need to talk to David," Margaret managed to say. "It's important." "Of course," Vanessa said soothingly. "I'll make sure he calls you this weekend. But you need to rest. You're not making sense, Margaret. You're confused. That happens with age and medication. Just rest." Margaret wanted to scream that she wasn't confused, that she knew exactly what was happening. But she was so tired, so much pain, so defeated. After Vanessa left, Margaret lay in her bed and cried. She'd never felt so helpless in her entire life. She'd survived poverty, widowhood, single motherhood. She'd been strong her entire life. And now she was trapped, weakened, at the mercy of people who wanted her gone. Margaret didn't know exactly why they were doing this, but she knew it had something to do with money. It always did. David was wealthy. Very wealthy. And as his mother, Margaret was his heir if anything happened to him. But if something happened to Margaret first, who would inherit? Vanessa. Margaret realized with horror that she was an obstacle. As long as she was alive, Vanessa couldn't fully control David's fortune. But if Margaret died, especially if she died appearing to be simply an elderly woman succumbing to natural age-related decline, Vanessa would have everything. And David, consumed with work and guilt, would never question it. Margaret's death would be sad but expected. An old woman with multiple health problems passing away peacefully in her sleep. No one would investigate. No one would suspect. Margaret understood now that she was being slowly killed. The isolation, the medication, the declining care. It was all designed to weaken her, confuse her, and eventually end her life in a way that would appear natural. She had to survive long enough to tell David. Had to find a way to make him see what was happening. But time was running out. Margaret could feel herself getting weaker every day, even without taking the pills. She was malnourished, in constant pain, psychologically devastated. How much longer could she hold on? As she drifted into an exhausted sleep that night, Margaret prayed that her son would come home. That he would see past the perfect facade Vanessa maintained. That he would notice his mother was dying. Please, David, she thought. Please come home and really look at me. See what they're doing. Save me before it's too late. The mansion was silent except for the sounds of Margaret's labored breathing. In another wing, Vanessa sat in the master bedroom, calmly planning her next steps. In Singapore, David finished another 18-hour workday, telling himself he'd visit his mother soon. He'd been saying that for months. Tomorrow would be too late. But David didn't know that. He had no idea that while he was building empires and closing deals, his mother was fighting for her life in his own home. He had no idea that the perfect wife he trusted was slowly murdering the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him. He had no idea that time was running out. But he was about to find out. Because sometimes fate intervenes. Sometimes planes get delayed or meetings get canceled or something makes you change your plans. Sometimes you come home when you're not expected. And sometimes when you walk through your door at the wrong time, you see the truth that was hidden in plain sight all along. David's awakening was coming. The question was whether it would come in time to save his mother, or whether he'd arrive home only to find that he was too late. That the woman who'd given him everything had died alone, in pain, crying out for a son who never came. David Harrison stared at his phone in the Singapore hotel room at 3 in the morning. He couldn't sleep, which wasn't unusual. Insomnia had been his constant companion for years, the price of building an empire. But tonight was different. Tonight he kept thinking about his mother. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually seen her in person. Video calls, yes. Brief phone conversations, sure. But physically being in the same room? It had been at least 3 months. Maybe 4. The realization made him feel sick with guilt. His entire life's purpose had been to provide for his mother, to give her everything she'd never had. And yet, he'd somehow managed to abandon her while keeping her under his own roof. David picked up his phone and scrolled through his text messages with Margaret. They were sparse. Mostly him asking if she was okay, and her replying that she was fine. But looking at them now, in the quiet dark of 3 a.m., something felt off. There was something almost formulaic about her responses. Never any details. Never any real conversation. Just, "I'm fine, sweetheart," over and over. David opened his calendar. The board meeting scheduled for tomorrow could be handled by his CEO. The investor presentations later this week could be done virtually. Everything urgent was actually just important, and important could wait. For the first time in years, David made a decision based not on business necessity but on his gut feeling that something was wrong. He booked a flight home. Not in 2 weeks as planned. Tomorrow. Today, actually, since it was already morning in Singapore. He'd surprise his mother. Maybe take her to lunch. Actually spend time with her, not just check in via video call while multitasking through emails. David landed at JFK 16 hours later, exhausted from the long flight but determined. He didn't tell Vanessa he was coming home. He wanted to surprise everyone, to see his home as it really was when no one was expecting him. The car service dropped him off at the mansion at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. The house looked perfect as always. Manicured lawns, impressive architecture, the kind of home that belonged in magazines. David let himself in through the front door, carrying his own luggage for once. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Where was everyone? Hello? David called out. No response. He walked through the main living area. Immaculate as if no one lived there. The kitchen was empty, though he could see meal prep for later in the day. He checked his home office. Everything in order. David felt something tighten in his chest. Where was his mother? He made his way to the guest wing, his footsteps echoing in the long hallway. He'd rarely been down here since his mother moved in. She'd always said she was fine, comfortable, resting. But walking this hallway now, David realized just how isolated this part of the house was. How far from everything. He reached his mother's suite and knocked softly. Mom? It's David. I came home early. No response. David's heart started pounding. He opened the door. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. His mother was lying in bed in the middle of the day, which wasn't unusual. But the state of her shocked him. Margaret looked like she'd aged 20 years. She was skeletal, her skin gray and paper-thin. Her breathing was labored. The room, while clean, had an air of neglect. Medications cluttered the nightstand. The water glass was empty. The curtains were drawn, leaving everything in dim shadow. Mom! David rushed to her bedside. Margaret's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him. Then clarity came into her eyes, followed immediately by tears. David! Her voice was barely a whisper. Oh, David. You're really here? I'm here, Mom. What's wrong? Why do you look like this? David was frantically checking her over, his hands shaking. When had his mother become so frail? How had this happened? Margaret tried to speak but started coughing. David grabbed the empty water glass and ran to the bathroom to fill it. When he came back, he helped his mother drink, horrified by how weak she was. Mom, I'm taking you to the hospital. Right now. No, Margaret grabbed his arm with surprising strength. No hospital. Not yet. I need to tell you something. Before she knows you're here. Before who knows? Mom, you're not making sense. You need medical attention. Listen to me. Margaret's voice was urgent despite its weakness. Your wife, Vanessa, has been... David, she's been drugging me. Poisoning me. I've been trying to tell you for months. David froze. What? Mom, that's a serious accusation. Are you sure you're not confused? The medications can sometimes... I'm not confused. Margaret tried to sit up but didn't have the strength. I stopped taking the pills. That's why I can think clearly now. But David, she's been isolating me, giving me something that makes me foggy and sick. The staff, they're in on it, or at least they know something. Please, you have to believe me. David's mind raced. His mother seemed lucid, but these accusations were insane. Vanessa poisoning her? Why would she do that? But looking at his mother's deteriorated condition, something was clearly very wrong. Okay, David said, trying to stay calm. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Margaret told him about the progressive isolation. The medication that made her confused and sick. The meals with strange tastes. The staff who avoided her. The phone service that never worked in her room. The nurse visits that became less frequent. The way Vanessa was always sweet and concerned when David was around, but cold when he wasn't. As Margaret spoke, David felt his world tilting. Details he'd never questioned suddenly seemed sinister. Vanessa's insistence that Margaret stay in the guest wing, for her comfort. The glowing reports about Margaret's care that never quite matched the few times David actually saw his mother. The way Vanessa managed all of Margaret's medical appointments and medications. She's trying to kill me, Margaret said bluntly. I think it's about inheritance. Money. If I die, she gets everything if something happens to you. I'm the obstacle to her controlling your fortune. David stood up, pacing the room. This couldn't be true. Vanessa was his wife. She'd been devoted to him for years. But then he looked at his mother again. Really looked at her. Saw the fear in her eyes. The desperation. The physical deterioration that was too extreme for natural aging. The pills, David said suddenly. Where are your pills? Margaret pointed to the nightstand. David gathered all the medication bottles and checked the labels. They were from doctors he didn't recognize. Prescriptions he'd never heard of. Who prescribed these? I don't know, Margaret said. The nurse brings them. I never see the doctors anymore. Vanessa says it's all being coordinated. David's hands clenched. Show me everything. Your journal, you said you kept notes? Margaret directed him to the mattress. David found the journal and the stash of pills his mother had been hiding instead of taking. He read through her documented experiences, his horror growing with each page. His mother had been suffering for over a year, slowly being isolated and poisoned, and he'd been too busy to notice. The guilt was overwhelming. But guilt could come later. Right now, he needed to get his mother to safety and figure out the truth. We're leaving, David said, helping Margaret to sit up. I'm taking you to the hospital, and we're going to have these medications analyzed. If Vanessa or anyone else has been doing what you say, I will make sure they pay for every moment of pain you've suffered. David, Margaret grabbed his arm. Be careful. She's smart. She'll have covered her tracks. And if she realizes I've told you. The door opened. Vanessa stood in the doorway, her face showing perfect surprise. David, I didn't know you were home. Why didn't you tell me? She looked at Margaret with false concern. Is everything okay? Margaret, you look upset. David looked at his wife with new eyes. She was beautiful, polished, perfect. And possibly a monster. We need to talk, Vanessa. About my mother's care. About a lot of things. Vanessa's smile never wavered. Of course. Let me just help Margaret get comfortable, and we can discuss everything. No, David said firmly, positioning himself between Vanessa and his mother. You don't touch her. You don't go near her. In fact, I want you to leave this room right now. For just a second, Vanessa's mask slipped. David saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. Then the perfect concern was back. David, you're scaring me. What's wrong? Did Margaret say something? She gets confused sometimes, you know that. The medications affect her memory. The medications you've been giving her, David interrupted. The medications prescribed by doctors I've never heard of. The medications that seem to make her worse, not better. Vanessa's face flushed. I don't like what you're implying. Everything I've done has been for Margaret's benefit. I've arranged the best care, in the most isolated part of the house, David continued, his voice getting harder. With staff who barely interact with her. With phone service that mysteriously doesn't work. With you managing every aspect of her medical care while I'm conveniently traveling constantly. Vanessa's expression shifted. The warmth disappeared, replaced by something colder. Be very careful, David. You're making accusations based on the confused ramblings of a sick old woman. Don't, David said dangerously, call my mother a sick old woman. Vanessa crossed her arms. What exactly are you accusing me of? I'm not accusing you of anything yet, David said. I'm taking my mother to the hospital to be examined by independent doctors. These medications will be analyzed. If there's nothing wrong, then we'll apologize for the misunderstanding. But if we find out you've been harming my mother... He let the threat hang in the air. Vanessa stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. Do whatever you need to do. I have nothing to hide. But I think you're going to feel very foolish when the doctors confirm that Margaret's health issues are simply age-related and that all her care has been appropriate. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and David? You might want to think about how this looks. Your elderly mother making wild accusations about your wife. It's sad, really, but it's a common symptom of dementia. After Vanessa left, David called his personal physician, Dr. Marcus Chin. Someone he'd known for 20 years. Someone he trusted. Marcus, I need you to come to my house immediately. And bring someone who specializes in toxicology. I think my mother's been poisoned. Within 2 hours, Dr. Chen arrived with a toxicologist, Dr. Patricia Reeves. They examined Margaret thoroughly, drew blood samples, and carefully documented everything. The pill bottles David had found were sent to a lab for immediate analysis. Mr. Harrison, Dr. Chen said after the examination, your mother is severely malnourished and dehydrated. She's showing signs of prolonged exposure to some kind of sedative or tranquilizer. We'll know more when the lab results come back, but her symptoms are consistent with deliberate drugging. David felt his rage crystallize into something cold and focused. How long until we have results? I've marked everything as urgent, Dr. Reeves said. We should have preliminary findings by tomorrow morning. But Mr. Harrison, your mother needs to be hospitalized immediately. Her condition is critical. David arranged for Margaret to be transported to a private hospital where he knew she'd be safe and well cared for. As the ambulance took his mother away, David stood in the guest suite, looking at the room where Margaret had been slowly dying. The room was at the end of a long hallway. Far from help. Far from anyone who might notice. Everything Vanessa had done, she'd done methodically. The isolation, the medical management, the staff's behavior. It had all been carefully orchestrated. David went through the room systematically. He found Margaret's hidden journal and took photos of every page. He collected all the medications. He even took samples of some half-eaten food from an earlier meal, just in case. He was building a case. If his mother's accusations were true, Vanessa would pay. Not just with divorce. With prison. His phone rang. It was his estate manager, Thomas. Mr. Harrison, I need to speak with you urgently. About Mrs. Margaret Harrison. What about her? Sir, I think there are some things you need to know. About the instructions we've been receiving regarding her care. I've been uncomfortable for a while, but I didn't know how to bring it up without seeming insubordinate. David's jaw tightened. Come to my office. Now. Thomas arrived within minutes. What he revealed made David's blood boil. Vanessa had been giving the staff specific instructions about Margaret's care, claiming they came from doctors. Margaret was to be left alone as much as possible, for rest. Her meals were to be basic and delivered without conversation. The nurse visits were scaled back because Margaret was stable. All of Margaret's incoming calls were to be screened by Vanessa. If Margaret tried to leave her suite, staff were to gently discourage her and report it to Vanessa. The staff had followed these instructions because they came from the lady of the house and seemed medically justified. But several of them had felt uncomfortable about it. Why didn't you tell me? David demanded. Sir, you were never here. And when you did call, Mrs. Vanessa always assured you that everything was fine. We're just staff. We didn't feel it was our place to contradict her. David realized how completely Vanessa had controlled the narrative. By keeping him away and managing all communication, she'd created a perfect bubble where her abuse could continue unobserved. The next morning, Dr. Reeves called with preliminary lab results. Mr. Harrison, your mother's blood work shows elevated levels of benzodiazepines and a powerful sedative called chlorpromazine. Neither of these medications were prescribed by any legitimate physician for her conditions. In fact, given her age and actual health issues, these drugs are extremely dangerous. Long-term use could have killed her. Could have? David asked. She's still alive. But Mr. Harrison, if this had continued much longer, your mother would have died. The combination of drugs, malnutrition, and isolation would have been fatal. Whoever was administering these medications knew exactly what they were doing. David thanked Dr. Reeves and immediately called his lawyer. I need you to file for divorce and I need you to contact the police. I have evidence that my wife has been systematically poisoning my mother. I want her arrested. The lawyer asked questions, took notes, and promised to move immediately. David then called the hospital where Margaret was being treated. How is she? Mrs. Harrison is responding well to proper nutrition and hydration, the nurse reported. The doctors have started her on a protocol to clear the drugs from her system. She's already more alert and communicative than when she arrived. Sir, I have to say, I've been a nurse for 30 years, and I've never seen a case of elder abuse quite this calculated. Elder abuse? That's what this was. Vanessa had been abusing his mother for months, maybe over a year, right under David's nose. And he'd been too busy, too trusting, too absent to see it. The police arrived at the mansion that afternoon. David presented all the evidence: Margaret's journal, the toxicology reports, the pill bottles, testimony from the staff, everything. Vanessa was arrested that evening as she returned from a spa appointment. David watched as officers put handcuffs on his wife of 5 years. She didn't cry or plead. She just looked at David with cold hatred. "You're making a mistake," she said. "I'll fight this." "You're going to lose," David replied. The investigation that followed uncovered even more damning evidence. Financial records showed that Vanessa had been slowly liquidating some of David's assets and moving money to offshore accounts. She'd been planning for a future where she had control of David's fortune, with Margaret gone and potentially with David meeting with an accident later. Emails recovered from her laptop showed conversations with a doctor who'd been willing to prescribe inappropriate medications for cash. The doctor was arrested too. The pills Vanessa had been giving Margaret were a cocktail designed to sedate, confuse, and slowly deteriorate her health. Given consistently over time, they would have eventually caused organ failure that would look like natural causes. It was attempted murder, carefully disguised as end-of-life care. The trial was sensational. A beautiful woman married to a billionaire, accused of slowly poisoning his elderly mother for inheritance money. The media couldn't get enough of it. But David didn't care about the publicity. He cared about his mother's recovery and seeing justice served. Margaret testified, her voice strong despite her ordeal. She described the isolation, the confusion from the drugs, the fear of knowing something was wrong but having no way to get help. She looked directly at Vanessa and said, "You tried to take everything from me. My health, my mind, my son, my life. But I survived. And now everyone knows what you are." The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Vanessa was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As she was led away, she finally showed emotion. Not remorse. Rage. "You were never supposed to come home early," she screamed at David. "You were supposed to stay away. This is your fault." David felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Justice had been served. Margaret's recovery was remarkable. Once the drugs were out of her system and she received proper care and nutrition, her health improved dramatically. The pain that everyone had attributed to age and arthritis was largely caused by the medications. Her actual arthritis was manageable with proper treatment. The confusion and memory issues disappeared completely once the sedatives were stopped. Margaret had been a healthy 72-year-old who'd been systematically destroyed by someone who was supposed to care for her. 3 months after Vanessa's conviction, Margaret moved into a beautiful apartment in a senior community. Not because she needed care, but because she wanted to be around people her own age. She'd regained her independence, joined clubs, started volunteering again. David visited her twice a week, every week, without fail. He'd restructured his company to require less travel. He'd learned that no business success mattered if you lost the people you loved. One Sunday, David and Margaret sat on her apartment balcony, having lunch together. The sun was warm, the view beautiful. Margaret looked healthy, vibrant, nothing like the dying woman David had found in that isolated guest suite. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, setting down her tea, "about starting a foundation for elder abuse awareness and prevention." David looked at his mother with admiration. After everything she'd been through, she wanted to help others. "Tell me more." Margaret leaned forward, passionate about the idea. "David, what happened to me happens to thousands of elderly people every year. They're isolated by family members or caregivers who are supposed to protect them. They're drugged, neglected, financially exploited. And because they're old, because they might be a little forgetful or confused, no one believes them when they try to get help." She pulled out a notebook where she'd been making notes. "I want to create resources for elderly people to recognize abuse. Hotlines they can call. Legal assistance. Safe houses if they need to escape dangerous situations. Education for medical professionals on recognizing signs of elder abuse and drugging." David felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Mom, that's incredible. And I want to fund it. Whatever you need. Margaret shook her head. I don't want your money, sweetheart. Well, not as a gift. I want to work for this. I want this foundation to be mine, something I built. You can make a donation like anyone else, but this is my project. David smiled. His mother was back. The strong, independent woman who'd raised him against all odds. But I'm making a very large donation. And I'm connecting you with people who can help. Lawyers, medical professionals, activists in this space. Deal, Margaret agreed. Over the following year, the Margaret Harrison Foundation for Elder Safety and Dignity took shape. Margaret threw herself into the work with the energy of someone who'd been given a second chance at life. The foundation's mission was clear: identify elder abuse, provide resources for escape and recovery, prosecute abusers, and change laws to better protect vulnerable elderly people. Margaret became a public speaker, sharing her story at conferences and in media interviews. She was compelling, articulate, and passionate. People listened when she described being trapped in her son's mansion, slowly poisoned by his wife, unable to get help. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, Margaret would tell audiences. It was the isolation. The feeling that I'd been erased. That I no longer mattered. That I could disappear and no one would notice. She'd pause, letting that sink in. Then she'd continue. But I did matter. I survived. And now I'm making sure that other elderly people know they matter too. That they have rights, resources, and people who will believe them. The foundation's hotline received thousands of calls in the first year. Many were from elderly people experiencing abuse or neglect. Others were from concerned family members or neighbors who suspected something was wrong but didn't know how to help. The foundation provided guidance, connected people with legal resources, and in urgent cases, helped coordinate with law enforcement and protective services. They also created educational materials for doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers on recognizing signs of elder abuse and medication misuse. Margaret's case had shown how easy it was to disguise abuse as legitimate medical care. Healthcare providers needed to be more vigilant. Margaret also pushed for legislative changes. She testified before state legislatures, advocating for stronger penalties for elder abuse and better protections for elderly people's autonomy and rights. Several states passed new laws as a direct result of her advocacy. David watched his mother transform from a victim into a warrior. He was incredibly proud, but also carried deep guilt. I should have noticed, he told her one day. I was so focused on providing for you financially that I never actually checked if you were okay. I failed you. Margaret took his hand. David, you didn't fail me. Vanessa deceived both of us. She was calculating and manipulative. Yes, you were busy. Yes, you should have visited more. But the person responsible for what happened is Vanessa, not you. But if I'd come home even once, then you would have discovered it sooner, Margaret agreed. And I'm grateful you came home when you did. But David, carrying guilt doesn't help anyone. What helps is learning from it and doing better going forward. Which you have. David had indeed changed his life significantly. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations of his company, appointing a CEO to handle the details while he focused on strategic direction. This allowed him to be more present, not just for his mother, but for himself. He'd been running from grief and fear for so long, burying himself in work. His first wife's death had devastated him, and he'd coped by becoming a workaholic. That had made him vulnerable to Vanessa's manipulation and blind to his mother's suffering. Now, David was in therapy, processing his grief properly. He'd started dating again, carefully, determined to choose a partner for the right reasons this time. He'd learned that real love involved presence, attention, and truly seeing the other person. The anniversary of Margaret's rescue came 2 years after that terrible day when David had walked into the guest suite and found his mother dying. The foundation held a gala fundraiser, and Margaret was the keynote speaker. David sat in the audience, watching his mother command the stage. She wore an elegant dress, her hair styled beautifully. She looked regal, strong, nothing like the broken woman she'd been. 2 years ago, I was dying, Margaret told the audience of donors and supporters. Not from old age or natural causes, but because someone who was supposed to care for me decided I was worth more dead than alive. I was isolated, drugged, and left to fade away in a beautiful prison. She paused, scanning the room. But I'm still here. I survived. And I'm using my second chance to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. Or if it does, that they have somewhere to turn, someone who will believe them, and resources to escape. Margaret shared statistics about elder abuse. The millions of elderly people affected every year. The underreporting because victims are often too scared or incapacitated to speak up. The financial exploitation that costs elderly Americans billions annually. Elder abuse happens in all communities, all economic levels, Margaret said. It happened to me in a multimillion-dollar mansion. It happens to others in modest homes, in nursing facilities, everywhere. We need to acknowledge that aging doesn't make someone less valuable or less deserving of dignity and safety. She concluded with a call to action. If you suspect someone is being abused, speak up. If you're elderly and experiencing abuse, know that help exists. You matter. Your life has value. Don't suffer in silence. The audience gave her a standing ovation. David stood too, tears streaming down his face. His mother had turned her trauma into purpose. She'd survived and was now saving others. After the gala, David and Margaret stood on the venue's terrace, looking at the city lights. I'm proud of you, Mom, David said. Everything you've built, everything you're doing. You're amazing. Margaret smiled. I'm proud of you too. For believing me when I told you what was happening. For acting immediately. For being there for me during recovery. And for letting me build this foundation my way, as my project, not something you controlled. David nodded. I learned something important through all this. That being present is more important than being provider. That love is shown through attention and time, not just money. Exactly, Margaret agreed. I never needed the mansion or the expensive care. I needed my son. I needed to be seen as a person, not a problem to be managed. That's what Vanessa never understood. People aren't assets or obstacles. They're people. They were quiet for a moment, then Margaret said, I want to tell you something. I've forgiven Vanessa. David looked at her in shock. What? How? Margaret shrugged. Forgiveness isn't for her. It's for me. I spent enough time being a victim of her cruelty. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being a victim of my own anger. Forgiving her means I'm free. You're a better person than I am, David said. I haven't forgiven her. I don't know if I ever will. That's okay, Margaret said. Forgiveness is personal. You'll get there when and if you're ready. Or maybe you won't, and that's okay too. David hugged his mother. I love you, Mom. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being here. I love you too, sweetheart. And I'll always fight. That's what I do. 3 years after the arrest, David received news that Vanessa was up for a parole hearing. She'd served only 3 years of her 25-year sentence, but the prison was overcrowded and she was being considered for early release. David was furious. Margaret was calm. We'll go to the hearing, she said. We'll tell our story. And then the board will decide. At the parole hearing, Vanessa looked different. Prison had aged her. She was thinner, harder, her beauty dimmed by years behind bars. She addressed the board, claiming she'd been rehabilitated, that she understood the severity of her actions, that she deserved a second chance. Then it was Margaret's turn to speak. She stood before the parole board with quiet dignity. Vanessa Harrison didn't just try to kill me, Margaret said. She tried to erase me. She isolated me, drugged me, and left me to die slowly while my son was away building his career. She took advantage of his trust and my vulnerability. Margaret looked directly at Vanessa. She's shown no real remorse. Her statement today was about what she deserves, what she wants. Not once did she acknowledge the depth of suffering she caused. Not just to me but to my son, who has to live with the guilt of not protecting me. To the staff she manipulated. To everyone her actions affected. The board denied parole. Vanessa would serve her full sentence. As they left the hearing, David felt vindicated. Margaret just felt tired. I'm glad that's over, she said. Now we can move on with our lives. And they did. The foundation continued to grow, helping thousands of elderly people annually. Margaret became a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights. David found balance in his life, prioritizing relationships over relentless work. He eventually remarried to a kind woman named Sarah who loved him for who he was, not what he could provide. Sarah and Margaret became close friends, bonded by their love for David and their mutual commitment to treating people with dignity and care. 5 years after the trial, Margaret celebrated her 78th birthday surrounded by family, friends, and foundation staff. She was healthy, active, and happier than she'd been in years. David gave a toast. To my mother, who taught me the most important lesson of my life. That being present is the greatest gift we can give. That paying attention to the people we love can literally save their lives. Mom, you survived because you're strong. But you thrived because you chose to turn your pain into purpose. I learn from you every day. Margaret raised her glass. To second chances. To speaking up when something is wrong. To believing people when they ask for help. And to my son, who came home at exactly the right time. Everyone drank. Then Margaret continued. I want to share something. When I was lying in that guest suite, dying and alone, I prayed that David would come home. That he would see me. Really see me, not just the reports and assurances that everything was fine. And he did. That's not luck. That's love. Even when we're too busy, even when we're distracted, real love finds a way. She looked around the room. All of you here tonight are part of my second life. The life I almost didn't get to live. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the foundation. Thank you for believing that elderly people deserve safety, dignity, and the right to be heard. That night, after the guests left, David and Margaret sat together like they now did regularly. David had learned that time with his mother wasn't an obligation. It was a gift. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't come home early? David asked. Margaret nodded. Sometimes. I probably would have died within another month or two. Vanessa would have cried at my funeral. You would have mourned without ever knowing the truth. And she would have slowly taken everything from you next. She squeezed his hand. But that didn't happen. You came home. You listened. You believed me when it would have been easier to think I was just a confused old woman. You saved my life, David. You saved yourself, David corrected. By refusing to take the pills. By keeping that journal. By surviving long enough to tell me the truth. I just listened. That's more than most people do, Margaret said. Listen. Really listen. So many people just hear what they want to hear, or what's convenient to hear. You heard what I was actually saying, even though it was terrible and frightening. David looked at his mother with overwhelming love and gratitude. I'll never stop listening. And I'll never take for granted that you're here. Every day we have together is a gift. Margaret smiled. Every day is a gift. That's what surviving teaches you. Not to waste time on things that don't matter. To appreciate the people who love you. To use your voice, and to hear others when they use theirs. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Margaret said, I got a letter yesterday. From a woman in Ohio whose mother was being abused by a caregiver. She called our hotline, we connected her with resources, and her mother is now safe. She wanted to thank me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That's 53 people now. 53 elderly people whose lives have been saved or improved because of the foundation. Because I survived and decided to do something with my between life and death. Second chance. David hugged his mother. You're my hero, Mom. You always have been. But now the whole world sees what I've always known. That you're extraordinary. As they said goodnight and David headed home to Sarah, he reflected on the journey of the past 5 years. He'd almost lost his mother to greed and cruelty. But he'd gotten her back. And in saving her, he'd saved himself. He'd learned to be present. To prioritize what truly mattered. To never again let work or any other obligation come between him and the people he loved. Most importantly, he'd learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is come home. Show up. Pay attention. See what's really happening, not just what people tell you is happening. If this story touched your heart, Subscribe to Every Mind Stories for more powerful true tales. Hit that like button if you believe our elderly deserve dignity and protection. Comment "Elders Matter" if you stand with those who refuse to let the vulnerable suffer in silence. Share this with someone who needs to remember to check on their aging loved ones. Because sometimes coming home unexpectedly isn't an interruption of your busy life. It's a chance to see the truth that was hidden in plain sight. It's an opportunity to save someone who desperately needs saving. David had come home and found his mother dying. But he'd also found the truth, stopped a killer, and ultimately saved not just one life but countless others through the foundation his mother built. The billionaire's mother had suffered pain every day, until her son came home and saw what his wife was doing. And that moment of seeing, that moment of really paying attention, changed everything. Thank you for watching Every Mind Stories. Remember, check on your elderly loved ones. Not just with phone calls but with real visits. See them with your own eyes. Listen with your full attention. Because sometimes, that's the difference.